Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm a somatic teacher and therapist. And this is another episode of my mini series where I'm showing you how to find more ease in your body, particularly when you move. And today we're going to look at the breath. So, breath really aids you in the movement if you move together with the breath. So basically what happens every time you take a breath in and almost your entire body starts moving. So it's really not just some sort of movement that happens only in the lungs, but that expansion of the lungs is connected with lots of other actions, especially of the diaphragm, this big muscle that divides your chest from the abdomen. And when you inhale, the diaphragm pushes downwards on the interior of your abdominal cavity, and that movement travels all the way down to your pelvic floor. But it also creates a little bit of an uplift in the chest. So there is basically the up and down expansion happening, but there's also the sideways expansion happening. So as the lungs expand, they move the rib cage. And then as the rib cage is connected with the shoulder girdle and shoulder girdle is connected with the arms, then basically the ripple effect travels all the way to your arms as well. You're gonna feel it also as a kind of expansion happening just because it goes all the way to your pelvic floor. There is that kind of expansive sensation moving to your legs as well through the pelvis. So if you initiate the movement from the breath, you can make way less, you can put way less effort into that movement. And there are lots of rules, whether it's in Pilates or in yoga or in somatics, when you should take an inhale, when you should take an exhale. And very often they're completely contradictory. But rather than trying to memorize that or keep it as a strict set, yes, I should always take an inhale then, I should always take an exhale there, think of what feels as a natural extension of that movement that starts from the breath. So in general, I would say that the inhale always leads to expansion or reaching outwards and away from the center, while the exhalation would be a natural coming back towards the midline and release. So this is what you will find that it actually makes sense. And another thing that happens is when you take an inhale, you create more effort. It's a more active part. Unless you make like a very purposeful exhale, when you really engage the abdominal muscles, the normal exhale is passive. So it makes sense to do an effort, an action on the inhale and release and dropping and sinking on the exhale. And one more thing that happens when you breathe is that constantly the pressure between various chambers, and especially the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity, but also in the pelvic cavity as well, changes. So sometimes you might find it easier to twist on the exhale just because that pressure changes. Okay, so let me just give you a couple of examples. And maybe let's begin with lying on the side. You could rest your head on top of your extended arm. And let's place the hand on your ribs. So that side of the rib cage which is facing the ceiling now. And perhaps closer towards the lower end of the rib cage. And very purposefully, focus more on breathing to that lung, which is now facing towards the ceiling. What happens to the hand, which is resting on the ribcage? Notice that it floats upwards on the inhale and that it returns towards the floor on the exhale. So the effort part is your inhale. The movement starts only with the breath. It's not that you're trying to reach with the ribcage upwards. Of course, you could do it as well this way. Let's say you forget about breath for a moment, and you simply have a task of reaching with the ribcage up towards the ceiling. You can contract a couple of muscles and make that movement happen. But compare which one feels easier. Do it with the breath, and do it as an kind of conscious engagement of a whole group of muscles. Do you feel the difference? How much easier it is to actually do it with the inhale. And now notice what happens with the surrounding bones. So when you inhale, and you make it maybe a little bit exaggerated, a bit bigger inhale, your hip bone, the top hip bone, starts moving down the mat. As there's more expansion, as there's this upward and downward movement that happens on the inhale, that moves, literally moves your pelvis downwards, away from your rib cage. And then when you exhale, it returns to its place. So again, you could create this movement on your own. Imagine that somebody attached some big hook to your hip bone and it's pulling with all the strength downwards. That means to the bottom of your mat or whatever you're lying on. And you can make this movement like in a mechanistic way without paying attention to your breath at all, right? But what if you use your breath instead? And as you inhale to that right lung, and especially lower end of the right lung, how the natural extension of that inhale will be that movement of the hip away from you. And how when you exhale, everything naturally returns, collapses, sinks into the air. The breath can be the initiator of this movement. And if we know that the breath moves everything downwards but also upwards, we could extend that movement even further by moving the arm over the head when you inhale, and then let it all release and return on the exhale. So there is a bit of that engagement starting from your lung. The rest of the bones follow. The bones follow the movement that starts from the breath. When you exhale, you can all release. That's just one of the examples. Okay. Now let's look at how the breath, the idea that the inhalation might be an effort and exhalation is a release, can make any movement and any kind of more challenging movement more sustainable. So let's say you lift your feet off the mat And then you can rock your pelvis to the right and to the left a couple of times. And then at some point, you can land, let's say, more on the right side of the pelvis or on your right buttock so that your left buttock is off the mat. You can even make it easier by slightly hooking your ankles. And then you can, so you have all the weight more on that right side of the pelvis, and the left arm can float up first. And then you can kind of point it at some 45 degrees roughly angle and find yourself something that you can reach towards, some actual object or point on the wall, as it's going to make it a little bit easier. And we're going to move through a little bit of an effort here. So there's going to be a moment of effort and a moment of release. So let's say that when you inhale, you're reaching outwards. You can look at the fingertips of that arm that is reaching out. This is your active part. But then you take an exhale. And on the exhale, your legs drop just a tiny bit down to the side. So every time you make an inhale, there's a moment of effort, and it makes sense that you do this effort with the inhale. But exhale, you're giving yourself a little bit of a break. Inhale is an effort, but exhale is a break. Inhale is reaching, exhaling is dropping. Inhaling is reaching, and exhaling is dropping, softening. Inhaling, reaching, exhaling. At some point, you will feel that your legs land somewhere, and then you can rest one leg on top of the other. You don't really need to try to place one knee on top of the other or anything like that. Wherever they can kind of rest, let them rest. And this is the moment where you can focus on that stage of exhalation. So every exhalation is your opportunity to soften and to sink your weight more. The weight of your feet, the weight of your pelvis, the weight of your shoulder blades, the weight of your head, and the weight of your arm. And you might also notice that the inhale doesn't make it very easy to create twist just because everything is really filled up. They're so filled up with the air. There's so much pressure inside all the cavities that there's no more space for movement. But when you exhale, there's just this little bit more space that suddenly you can find. And then again, it would be the inhalation. So a little bit of an effort, a little bit of engagement through the core that makes you return to the midline. Might be interesting to notice what happened, what changed. And of course, I invite you to pause the video and do all of these things I showed you on the other side. Here, I'm just showing you the principles. So it's only an illustration of the principle, really. Okay. So let's say that this would be two examples of how you could use the breath, but there is more. And sometimes it's good to challenge what you've learned in whatever kind of discipline that you're doing. So you might have heard something like this, that if you are in all fours your inhale is when you are creating this kind of big arch in the lower back or in the back in the spine, and your exhale is when you are pushing the spine and rounding the back towards the sky. And if you've been doing it for many years, it starts feeling natural because you were trained to do it and it becomes automated. But try to have like a beginner's mind and notice how it would be to do it exactly the other way around, or maybe even let's do something different. Let's say at first you want to find your neutral spine, somewhere where you have that very stable base through all your four limbs, some connection between your tail and the top of the head. And then again, let it be a breath-led movement. So it's not so much the movement that you want to match later with the with the breath, but really you start with the inhale. And depending on where you want to kind of direct that inhalation, let's say that you place all your awareness on the back side of the lungs. By the way, 2/3 of your lungs are in the back side of your body. So it makes sense that you use that space. So when you're inhaling to all that space, it's going to float up. And then you just use that to maybe extend it a little bit more. It doesn't mean that it's gonna be extreme, that like super, super rounded shape. It doesn't need to be. So you're just slightly floating on that movement that happens anyway. Yeah. So let's say you're feeling how that back of the lungs expands. That creates some rounding in the back. And then when you exhale, you return to neutral. So you're simply allowing that all that to sink back to where you started. So you're doing it exactly opposite to what you might be used to, but it still makes sense, right? You inhale. And the back of the lungs gets filled up. There's this expansion happening there. And on the exhale, you let it return to neutral position. You could do it a couple of times here. Really waiting for the breath to lead you rather than start the movement with engaging the muscles and then making the breath follow. It's a very big difference. But then, okay, you could do it the other way as well, right? If you want to, let's say, expand the front of the chest and that area along the collarbones when you inhale. That's also possible, right? That's when you will get more of that downward curve. And then you let it return. So notice how you feel about it and how you could play with what others tell you to do, how they tell you when to breathe in, when to breathe out. Basically, usually you're kind of gonna feel yourself that something feels like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It flows with my breath. And it also makes a lot of sense to start with the breath and match the movement to the breath rather than the other way around. You could even play with something like inhaling to fill up the whole back of the body, but then exhaling, letting it drop. So maybe there is that opening in the front of the chest that again you might be used to, that it's your natural moment to inhale, but actually here you're kind of unraveling. So it makes sense you exhale as well. But try it out. What makes more sense to you? Maybe you prefer to inhale here. If you make it very chesty, maybe it makes sense as well. But I really encourage you to kind of explore it by yourself. And particularly notice that even when you're still, and maybe we can finish with that, even when you're lying still, it's never a perfect stillness unless you're holding your breath. When you're lying down, when you're sitting, and whenever else, you're never perfectly still. The breath flows through your body and it moves it without you needing to do anything about it. You might use it to exaggerate what already starts with the breath. So if you started paying more attention to that expansion of the belly that happens on the inhale, you will notice that it will create the arch in the back, the tilt in the pelvis, and even a little bit of outward rotation in your arms, maybe even a little bit of opening through the pelvis. And you could kind of exaggerate it. And then when you exhale, it's more like returning and closing. If it's a engage exhale, that creates a bigger movement. But most of the time, you don't really need to use that engaged exhale. The exhale is a passive part. The exhale is what works for you to settle, to sink deeper. So every time you inhale, there is an expansion outwards, but everything you exhale, there is no more effort. You're slowly sinking, returning, surrendering to the gravity. And there is a moment of stillness. And that is that short pause between your exhale and the next inhale. This is the moment of true stillness. And it could possibly the most relaxing place you could ever find. So I hope that you found this little exploration helpful. And as usual, I really encourage you to play with it, to explore it. So you might notice what happens when you twist on the exhale, how that might help. There's an entire video just on that. You could play with how it is to use the inhale to do any sort of reaching away or engage sort of movement. Play with it and notice how almost every movement could be led from the breath, could be initiated with that constant expansion and retraction that happens through the breath. So I hope that you really enjoyed this video, and I also would like to point your direction to a couple of videos that where I show some breathing awareness techniques where you can really feel that 360 degrees breath, which sometimes is not the case in the beginning just because you develop some patterns of breathing with top of the lungs, only using only that small area or using muscles in your neck or in your shoulders, which is totally not necessary, and kind of getting stuck the diaphragm. So I point you to some of this, and I'll see you next week. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe And I would also like to invite you to join my newsletter with kindness, where I share more of these ideas, how you could really find the lightness and ease in your life, especially if you struggle with holding a lot of tension that is connected to chronic stress and anxiety. Have a lovely day. Thank you.